Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for attending this Sunday afternoon. On the screen is the cover of my book. And before I get into my book talk, I wanted to do something I have not done in my other talks, which is, for those of you who haven't read it, I have a bunch of acknowledgments in the front of the book, and they're mostly people in our congregation. I just wanted to tell you who they are and give them my special thanks. And they include Myrna Goldenberg, who suffered through a very early draft, Marcia Teichman, who probably doesn't remember, but gave me some very valuable insights about growing up in Arlington. In the acknowledgement, I gave a special thanks to our clergy, to Rabbi Sid and Fred and Rachel, because I thought their spiritual guidance convinced me there's something profoundly important about why Jewish religion must survive. And I gave a special thanks in my book to Audrey Lyon, who I don't think is on the call, but who has really been a leader and a stunning example of selfless devotion to Jewish education since I've been at Adat Shalom. And then I wanted to thank all of you in the congregation, because I think Adat Shalom has been, for me, for almost 30 years now, the perfect spiritual home for my family. So my book begins with those acknowledgements, and I've not had a chance to say it out loud, except for this group. And so now I've done it. And so thank you, everybody. All right, so my book's title suggests that it's about a journey from Vilna to the suburban South, and about an effort to reclaim Jewish identity. And there's a hint in the title that something might have been lost in the journey from the old country to the new world. And I suggest in my book that what was lost was part of our Jewish identity, and I think may account for why we see a fall off in Jewish observance and Jewish literacy. So for that reason, I've entitled my talk, "Is American Jewry Hanging by a Thread?" It's an edgy title, but it reflects my belief that one of the most consequential issues facing American Judaism today is the question of assimilation, continuity, and survival. And I want to suggest that this is a timely issue by looking at three parallel publications that came out just about the same time as my book. First is the Pew Report that came out in May of 2021, actually just a few days before my book was published. The Pew Report collected some very disturbing data on the state of American Jewry. For example, you can see in this slide, it announced that about a quarter of US Jewish adults really don't identify with the Jewish religion, and they consider themselves to be what they call nothing in particular Jews. The Pew Report also found that many American Jews are not even concerned with whether their grandchildren are Jewish. When the Jerusalem Post saw the Pew Report, they said, "We are coming apart at the seams." And I thought this phrase, "nothing in particular Jews," might be the subtitle for my talk today. The second book that I want to make mention of is by Dara Horn, called "People Love Dead Jews." The opening line in her book is this: "People love dead Jews, living Jews, not so much." Her leading example is that of a worker at the Anne Frank exhibit in Amsterdam who was asked not to wear a yarmulke because it might make visitors feel uncomfortable. Dara's premise is that the effect of widespread assimilation is to, what she calls, erase our Judaism. She claims we don't even notice the effects of assimilation anymore, that we pretend Christmas and Hanukkah all celebrate the same value of peace on earth, goodwill to men, when in fact, she argues, holidays have nothing in common. We are embarrassed to be Jewish, she says. Next is a relatively new book by Clint Smith called "How the Word is Passed." He writes that we are formed by the visual images that surround us in daily life. His own formation was deeply affected by what he calls the iconography of the South. The statues of Robert E. Lee and Jeb Stuart all around him were key factors in his development. And he learned a lesson that I learned. We believe what we see. Clint Smith's book was true for us Jews in the South. The images we saw all around us were Christian and Southern, but rarely Jewish. There were few, if any, Jewish symbols in our schools, and nothing in our daily life really reminded us of our Judaism. We didn't have Ben Gurion Airport, and we didn't have any streets named after Jews. When I give this talk, what I usually hear people say, isn't that really true of all religions? And I guess that is true to some extent. And just a few weeks ago, the New Yorker had this quote: in America, more people believe in space aliens, 65%, than the 64% who believe in the biblical God. And a friend of mine told me when I read in this quote, it looks like the golden age of American Judaism is over. But Rockingham Street, my book, somewhat by accident, is the missing link that ties together these different views into what I hope is a coherent whole. All of these works, mine included, really ask this: why did things turn out like this? What did we or our grandparents do to make the Pew Report our reality? My hope is that Rockingham Street makes a contribution to these current issues. I don't think it's enough to read the Pew Report, which tells us how many Jews still believe and how many don't, nor Dara Horn, who tells us how many Jews, or how Jews rather, feel bad about being Jewish. I think we need to look for the root causes to see how we got here, and then to try and tease out the differences between issues like assimilation versus literacy. And yet here's the odd thing. On Rockingham Street was never intended to be a treatise on Jewish education or assimilation. My book, when I started, was meant to be a story about Saul and Anna, my paternal grandparents, shown here in this picture, who in 1913 made the journey from Vilna to Chicago and later to the suburban South. It was meant to be a story of a journey and then an attempt to reclaim Jewish identity, and then to ask this hard question: is that reclamation even possible given where we are now? When I started, it was meant to honor their memory and their courageous journey from the old country to the new country. But I made an important discovery in writing this memoir that made me begin to confront the issue of Jewish survival and continuity. Because in doing this memoir, I came to learn that when they immigrated to America, they brought with them the desire to be free of observant Judaism, and that this was the outgrowth of the Jewish Enlightenment in Europe. So by looking at the life of Saul and Anna, and then my own parents, Esther and Joe, I now began to see what began 100 years earlier in Europe, found its way into the suburban South, and gave permission to us Jews to not only become fully assimilated, but to begin the process of losing touch with Jewish texts and even the basic ability to read them. So somewhere in this story of Saul and Anna is the possible root cause of how we're living our Jewish life today and how we got to the Pew Report. In fact, I began to see that the Pew Report and Dara Horn and Rockingham Street are really companion pieces. The Pew Report is what I now think of as the last unfinished chapter of my memoir. My book is the eyewitness account from street level, and the Pew Report is the body count of the missing and disinterested Jews. Another discovery I made in writing my memoir is that the story of Saul and Anna, the one I want to share with you in a few minutes, suggests that the classic narrative we use to describe our journey may be wrong. On Rockingham Street challenges the notion that stories like Fiddler on the Roof are the typical narrative that explain our Jewish experience. My narrative is the opposite of Fiddler on the Roof. While Tevye was hanging on to tradition, Saul and the millions like him were throwing off tradition. My story is that of Saul, who was a child of the Jewish Enlightenment in Europe. My narrative is closer to Hamilton. Saul was determined to be secular and rational, but not to be an observant Jew. He was the ambitious immigrant who realized that in New York, you can be a new man. Saul might have agreed it was wise to talk less and smile more. I think Saul might have agreed with Dara Horn that he wanted to erase his life in the old country, which is why my prologue is entitled The Sacred Act of Remembering, but the first chapter is called On Forgetting. Saul's narrative venerates the birth of America as the true second creation story, far more than the birth of the Jewish people at Mount Sinai and the giving of the Ten Commandments. In my narrative, the colonial South plays a starring role. The Southern narrative is one rich in Southern iconography, but barren of Jewish symbols that remind the soul to think of Torah as we walk through our day. Because I discovered in writing this that in America it was and still is easy to be a nothing in particular Jew. Well, what I wanted to tell you was a story when I wrote my memoir, or so I thought. Saul and Anna's story began in Vilna in the late 1800s. Vilna was known as the Jerusalem of Lithuania, and Napoleon called it the Jerusalem of the North. Vilna was the home of the Vilna Gaon, one of the greatest Talmudic commentators of all time. And the picture on the slide is the great synagogue built in 1630. The Jewish synagogue was the dominant icon of Vilna. In Vilna, what the eye saw was that Judaism was everywhere. Orthodox Judaism was a part of daily life. Shabbat could be felt in the quiet streets on sundown on Friday afternoons. Judaism in Vilna was palpable. The notion of the Torah was a living presence. But some of that was coming to an end and was being challenged because Vilna was the home of a radical movement called the Haskalah. I'm sure most of you know about this. It was a movement which was turning away from observant Judaism and stressed instead the importance of a secular and rational life. The movement began in the 1770s, but it was still very active when Saul and Anna were born. And I believe we can understand the Enlightenment and how it affected Saul and Anna by a quick glance at the writings of Chaim Grod. Chaim Grod was described by Elie Wiesel as the greatest living Yiddish writer. He was also called the Faulkner of Yiddish literature. And today there's actually a course at Harvard devoted entirely to his writings. The opening lines of the novel, The Yeshiva, tell us everything I think we know about the Enlightenment in Vilna and what Saul and Anna were witnessing. Here's what the opening chapter says about a young Torah student who was racked with doubts about the existence of God. He was grappling with a fundamental principle. He knew that there was a Torah, and that without Torah, man couldn't find his way. But he didn't know whether the Torah was divinely given, and what if he isn't sure of the first principles of Maimonides. Maimonides, of course, wrote that the first principle, the belief in the Creator. And in Vilna, what Saul saw was that rabbis, scholars, and ordinary tailors like him were turning away from that. So what's critical to note is that this turn against observance was led by those who were Orthodox and had been trained in Jewish text. This wasn't a minor scuffle, but a paradigm shift. Chaim Grod's wife would later write that her husband was really just trying to show the tension between the sacred and the profane. But I now believe this tension between the sacred and the profane was never resolved. In fact, never can be resolved. And much of what we see today, what we think of as the American assimilation, is simply a continuation of what began in Europe over 100 years ago. And I think Saul had his heart on the profane or the secular, call it what you will. I know that Saul was in direct contact with the secular movement because I discovered his ship manifest from 1913 that had to be completed at the port of embarkation. The manifest was required by US law to identify where the immigrant was headed in America. The ship manifest told me that Saul was going to live with his cousin, Abraham Grod, but it also included the remarkable finding that Abraham Grod was Saul's first cousin, and Abraham Grod was the half-brother of the soon-to-be famous Chaim Grod. They were half-brothers because they had the same father, but different mothers. So the father of both Abraham and Chaim was a leading radical rabbi in Vilna who was challenging observant Judaism. So what I discovered, in a word, was that the Grade family was at the epicenter of this turn away from observant Judaism. And even more, what I discovered was that was my family. When Saul arrived in America, he moved in with the Grods for 3 years, right into the center of the storm. And I believe that Abraham, Chaim, and Saul all shared these deep doubts about Judaism, the Torah, and their fundamental belief in God. So this ship's manifest was a key clue that Saul was going to America with this strong belief in secularism, and that he was more than willing to turn his back on much of observant Judaism. Saul boarded the SS Montrose in the summer of 1913 and headed to Quebec, his first stop on the way to Chicago. From there, he went to his new home in Chicago to live with Abraham Grod. He left for all the reasons you always hear: the draft, the pogroms, but also the burdens of observant Judaism. Anna, his wife, didn't go with him because her father had been sent to Siberia, and she insisted she wanted to go east and try to find him first. Anna, who was far more religious than Saul, I think had doubts about him and his lack of Judaism. In writing my memoir, I tried to see Saul in my mind's eye on the SS Montrose. And I began to see him walking the deck, worried about his wife, Anna, who will take 3 years to join him. I saw him constantly checking his small suitcase for his belongings and where he saw his thimble and his thread. These were the humble tools that he was hoping would give him life in the new world. But Saul is done with the old world. He leaves his prayer book behind. His daily davening is done for now. And most of his observant Judaism, Saul left in the Atlantic Ocean. But here's the key thing for me, and this was another major discovery in doing my family memoir. Saul wasn't the only young Jewish tailor on the Montrose that day, filled with doubts about Judaism. Respected Jewish writers have noted that what I saw in Saul is what occurred for many Jewish immigrants. Professor Barry Schrage said this about the Jews who came over at the same period that Saul did. He writes this: serious Jewish learning, Jewish literacy, became marginal goals for American Jewry. And as a result, being Jewish lost its meaning for many American Jews. This notion that there's a direct link between Jewish literacy and Jewish meaning is really at the heart of what we might learn about Saul's journey to the suburban South. It just might be that the absence of Jewish literacy is the core issue in our modern Jewish world. So I think now that Saul's story is your story, maybe the story of your grandparents as well, and what I now think laid the groundwork for the Pew Report. Saul and Anna lived in Chicago for 36 years before they moved to Arlington. This is a picture of where they actually lived, in Chicago at 2951 Broadway. Saul and Anna were actually both great tailors, and they did very well in business. Saul was gregarious, social, people liked him, but their Jewish life was sparse. In my memoir, we first meet Saul in 1930. He's taking a break and walking down Broadway Street. His son Joe was supposed to be having a bar mitzvah that year, but Joe almost didn't have it because Saul refused to pay the tuition. My father was actually kicked out of Hebrew school. Anna barely saved the bar mitzvah by paying the cost through money she'd put aside without telling Saul. So when we first meet Saul on Broadway, he's taking a break from his work, and he's just purchased some deep fried shrimp from Dime Pier near Lake Michigan. Anna is home getting Shabbat dinner ready. Saul is a tailor, and he's trying to keep the grease in the brown paper bag from soiling his suit. What he's really trying is to hide from Anna his disinterest in things kosher, in things Jewish. because by now, by 1930, the thoughts of Vilna, the thoughts of the Jerusalem of Lithuania, have mostly been laid aside and forgotten by Saul. This pattern of laying aside Jewish observance and moving away from the knowledge of Jewish texts then continues into the next generation. Saul and Anna's first son, Joseph, my father, shown in the upper right, was born in 1917. The handsome man on the far left is my uncle Julius. Joe married Esther Aronson in 1939, shown here in this picture. She's the granddaughter of a Cohen, but they were hardly of the priestly class. Esther's family is also non-observant, and her family will later move to California, some of whom will become Christian. And they, like Saul, their Jewish life in Chicago is sparse. They're not married in a synagogue, although a rabbi does officiate and there is a ketubah. Their first son, Richard, is shown in the picture. His baby book, which I discover is a Christian publisher, from a Christian publisher. And I went through it and I discovered there's no record of a Jewish circumcision or a bris, no record that Esther and Joe ever attended synagogue or joined one, no library of Jewish books, no mementos of Jewish culture. I doubt they kept Shabbat. I know they didn't keep kosher. And when Esther's younger brother died this year, his funeral was held in a church. Later in life, when we had meals in Arlington, milk and meat were served at every meal. I grew up without knowing that observant Jews don't eat hamburgers or cheeseburgers. In 1947, my father, Joe, accepted a job at the American Chemical Society, which had its headquarters in Washington, D.C. They moved to a small neighborhood in Arlington, Virginia called Glebewood, located at the intersection of Lee Highway and Glebe Road. Here's a picture of what it looks like today, obviously different than then. But back then, it didn't have a single Jewish family. And from the kitchen window, we saw the old Glebe Theater, which you see in the picture to the right, and its parking lot. The movie being shown in 1945 was called God is My Pilot. I don't think that was a Jewish God. I also wondered why Esther and Joe, when they came to Washington, why didn't they move to the Jewish suburbs of Montgomery County or Chevy Chase or Silver Spring, where there was a large Jewish population? I don't think my father ever inquired as to where the Jews lived. He found a place on a bus line close to DC. Like Saul before him, his focus was on his work and on his career. Instead, they chose Arlington, which at that time did not have a single established synagogue, and its only Jewish congregation met in a shoe store in Clarendon, Virginia. It became clear to me in looking back that when Esther and Joe came to Virginia and to Washington, they were doing what Saul had done. They were leaving most of their Jewishness behind. In 1952, Esther and Joe finally moved to Rockingham Street. That's where I grew up. I named the book after the street because I believe geography is destiny, because the symbols and images that surround us form us. Iconography of where we grow up matters. We do tend to believe what we see far more than what we're told. And what we saw was a Christian world and a Southern world. Rockingham Street was only 1 block from Lee Highway. You know, the highway that runs through the state of Virginia and named after one of America's greatest traders. If you grew up in the suburban South, then everywhere you looked were statues of the Confederates. Every school was named Jeb Stuart or Robert E. Lee or something like that. No one was embarrassed by the Confederate flag. The South accelerated the assimilation, in part because of its powerful and seductive iconography. All of it was wrong, and all of it was constantly around us. And although Arlington and Northern Virginia today is profoundly different, not so in the 1950s and 1960s, it was holding on to its Southern heritage with all of its might. None of its schools were integrated until 1959, and only then with the help of the police. Here's my home 70 years later. A friend of mine sent this to me when I was doing these talks. The culture of that period was also important. Dwight Eisenhower was president in 1950, Eisenhower was known as the cornflakes president. This is because the advertising agency had helped elect him. But I had another reason. I thought it was because of a period in our cultural history that was bland, soggy, and tasteless. There were no revolutions when I was growing up. Democrats and Republicans spoke to one another. Young people weren't involved in politics. There were no Beatles. Elvis Presley didn't appear until I was in 6th grade. I Love Lucy and Arthur Godfrey were the two most popular shows on TV, and Peyton Place was considered sexy. The same may be said of the kind of Jewishness I experienced in the suburban South. It too was soggy and tasteless. Our lackluster Judaism seemed to fit the culture perfectly. I was essentially an illiterate Jew. So were my parents and my contemporaries. That's how much of life was led in the 1950s. What I saw was a consequence of an entire generation of Jews who wanted to be unfettered by religion and for whom Jewish learning was simply not a key part of their life. What I was seeing in the suburban South was a direct result of what Saul and Anna brought with them from Vilna as part of the Jewish journey. But I saw something else that reminded me how small Judaism seemed compared to the majestic Catholic churches. If Vilna was the Jerusalem of Lithuania, I asked myself, well, what should I call Arlington? It felt to me like the Catholic Empire, impressive and omnipotent, a place with beautiful churches and expensive parochial high schools. Everywhere I looked, I saw the majestic iconography of Christianity. I was overwhelmed with a sense of this large, omnipotent religion with its richly colored and sometimes violent icons of virgin births and crucifixions. All that was startling and riveting. We Jews were outgunned. Our Judaism seemed so small by comparison. By way of contrast, Arlington in the 1950s was a place where the only synagogue was in a shoe store in Roslyn, where you could either pray or buy a pair of Buster Brown saddle shoes. I noted that the Catholics were providing their children with an intensive and multi-year education that had no Jewish parallel in places like Arlington. I know you could find a day school somewhere in Washington, but not a single Jewish family I knew sent their children to those or even mentioned they existed. Early in Arlington, we copied much of what our Christian neighbors did. Dara Horn was right. We wanted to look like our Christian neighbors. If you can't fight them, join them. You know, the battle cry of the assimilated. So here in Arlington, we celebrated Christmas with our neighbors. We had a Christmas tree, and we visited Santa Claus to tell him we had been good and what toys we wanted. And in John Marshall Elementary School, I said the Lord's Prayer each day. Prayer, I think, was meant for Jesus. In the 1950s, we wanted to be cowboys. Dale Evans and Roy Rogers were our heroes. I don't think we heard anything about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Friday night was football night at the local high school, Washington and what else, Lee. We never lit candles on Friday night. Saturday morning was a work day, cutting grass, running errands. I don't recall a single time when around our dinner table we talked about the weekly Torah portion. I don't think I knew there was a weekly Torah portion. And when we didn't celebrate the holidays, it was less than full-hearted. I don't think we were meticulous. I have a section in my book called Passover at Sears. I've always thought the title of the section was all you needed to know about my upbringing. The notion that we were not supposed to eat bread during Passover gave away my family. If on the 5th or 6th day of Passover, my father needed building supplies from Sears, well, we went shopping. And while there, we would stop at the lunch counter in the basement, and we'd have a Hires root beer and a Briggs hot dog on a bun. No concern about matzah. The Kuney family had lost its sense of the meticulous attention to custom and tradition, but we were not alone. We were the children and grandchildren of the European Enlightenment. The sacred and the profane were still at war with each other. Well, despite all of this seeming indifference to observance, oddly enough, there came a time when the first steps to reclaim our Jewish identity began. And whether that reclaiming was enough is still an open question. But here's what happened. And though I was young, I still remember it very well. In 1953, Anna and Saul actually moved to Arlington. I don't know for sure why they came, but here's what I do know. One day while we were still living in Gleewood, and shortly before our move, I came home from first grade, excited with a color picture of Jesus. Anna was visiting us from Chicago. I thought Jesus looked wonderful, and I told Anna how impressed I was with the picture. Anna was horrified. She told me, "We Jews don't believe that Christ is God." That was news to me. Who had I been praying to? Well, after that, and shortly after that, it was just a matter of months after the Jesus picture, Saul and Anna left Chicago, and they moved 2 blocks away from our home on Rockingham Street. And from that moment on, Saul and Anna were in our lives almost daily. I could always find them working in their back workroom with their 1930 black sewing machine. They were wonderful tailors. They fixed all of our touring clothes, but I don't think Anna moved to Arlington to fix our clothes. And I'd like to read to you a little bit about what I wrote about her in the beginning of our possible reclamation in Arlington. I start 3rd grade in 1953. Saul and Anna move around the corner from our new home on Rockingham Street to the land of the Broyhill Plantation, a land filled with car dealerships and temples for the Babbitts. Saul and Anna had never been inside a car dealership. They had never seen a suburb. I think now they might have come to save us. After all, we still had a Christmas tree that first year on Rockingham Street. Anna soon put an end to that. I think now that no small part of the move was Anna's decision. In a word, Anna was coming to put an end to Christmas for the Cuneys. She had fought with Saul enough over being observant, put up with his refusals to let her boys attend Hebrew school, and his seeming indifference to their bar mitzvahs. When she saw that we were ignoring our Judaism, that we were celebrating Christmas, saying prayers in school that referred to our Savior, she may have insisted that she and Saul move to Arlington to do what could be done to save some small part of our Jewishness. She would bring 3 sets of dishes from Chicago and change them each Passover, although I'm sure we never paid much attention to which were for milk and which for meat. Anna still lit Shabbat candles, covering her head with napkin, hands over her eyes, saying the blessing in a language we did not understand. Eyes closed, her thoughts perhaps returned to Vilna, or to parents who had long since vanished from her life, or to something else, the young man she had loved for a short time in Siberia, and then had to leave behind. Every Jewish holiday meant dinner with Saul and Anna, and a great feast, food beyond reason. Food was for us the great transmitter of tradition and culture, but not quite enough. Not Torah, but perhaps threads of Torah, and the warm and succulent meals she labored over to share with us here in Arlington. Around this small table, the 7 of us clustered. Anna was the cook and baker that Esther never was, and I suspect never wanted to be. Esther was absorbed in helping Joe, and dinner was nothing more than a task to get done. Food was how Anna spoke to us about things that have no words. Another major factor in our journey and our possible reclamation was the coming of age of the Arlington Fairfax Jewish Center. In 1947, ground was broken on Arlington's first synagogue. It was initially the Arlington Jewish Center, and then later became the Arlington Fairfax Jewish Center. And it remains today the only conservative synagogue in Arlington, although Olam Tikva in Fairfax is now the largest synagogue, I'm told, in the state of Virginia. In 1952, the center hired Rabbi Noah Galinkin, who was a visionary leader. He was from Vilna. In fact, he actually knew Chaim Grod. They were Havruta partners when they were both there. Jewish literacy was key to Rabbi Galinkin. He recognized that Jewish survival and Jewish literacy, were inseparable. He was a fervent believer that reading Hebrew and Jewish text was at the core of Jewish continuity and survival. But he quickly discovered that many of the Jews of Arlington, Fairfax were Jewishly illiterate. He knew that when adults came to services, they were utterly lost as to what the prayers in Hebrew meant, and were even unsure on what page he was chanting from. So Galinkin said he wanted every congregant to be able to, in his own words, point with their finger on the text while the rabbi chanted the prayers. Pointing and nothing more. No grammar, no real translation, just the barest minimum of sight reading the block Hebrew letters. I think Galinkin identified the core problem. What he saw was larger than just not being able to read. He saw we didn't understand what was being said in our services. He saw that we sat silent in a state of confusion and loss of interest. We'd given up on Hebrew. What he saw, in short, was that our community was deeply illiterate. And because we couldn't read our text, we couldn't understand what it meant to be Jewish. Little wonder that many of us could not sit through a 3-hour service without wishing we were somewhere else. Little wonder that years later, the Pew reports would say that only 12% of Jews even show up for services regularly. Little wonder synagogues are losing members. But then the biggest surprise of all, and sometimes small things change history. If there's a turning point in this journey, it was when began with Esther and not with Torah. Rabbi Galinkin needed a secretary, and my mother was a gifted secretary. So my mother then worked for her for decades as first a secretary and then the executive administrator who basically ran the synagogue. Had my mother not been a great secretary, I think our efforts to reclaim our Jewish identity might never have occurred. Because from that moment on, talk of managing the business of a synagogue dominated our family life. Our dinner conversation focused equally on Henry the janitor as much as on the rabbi. And at some point, there was no longer a line between our synagogue life and our private life. Our home is simply an extension of the Arlington Fairfax Jewish Center. I wasn't really a conservative Jew. I was an administrative Jew. I knew where the mops and pans were kept. I just didn't know what the weekly Torah portion was. One thing led to another, I think because of my mother. My father became the president of the synagogue, and my older brother became the Sunday school clerk. As president, Joe had to sit on the bima for 2 years during the Saturday service and listen to the Torah being read and listen to the sermons. And then on Sundays, he would attend the Jewish adult education class. And now for the first time, Joe was beginning to learn things he had never known as a younger man. And I wonder now if somewhere in all this learning and listening, Joe is starting to reclaim some small part of his Jewish identity. Joe is a brilliant man who had graduated from the University of Chicago and now was seeing for the first time what had been tossed into the Atlantic Ocean sometime in 1913 in that fateful journey by Saul on the SS Montrose. And yet, it really was not enough. There was still something lacking in us, we, the second generation of American-born Jews. There was something seriously lacking in our twice a week Hebrew school. We didn't truly engage in immersive textual study, something at the heart of both Jewish learning. I don't recall we ever opened up a book by any of the famous modern commentators. We didn't really study Hebrew grammar. We couldn't really conjugate a verb. It just was not enough. I don't think you can find your way into Torah without a guide. And so as I wrote the memoir and began to look back at this Jewish education, I began to ask this question. Regardless of how observant we wish to be, can we really maintain our historic and distinctive role in world civilization without a deeper knowledge of our sacred text and the brilliant commentators who make them come alive. And as I wrote my memoir, I began to ask this: maybe assimilation isn't the problem, but the lack of Jewish literacy. Now I began to wonder, was I really just telling a story about Saul and Anna? Well, all of this is history now. What did any of it matter? And that brings me back to today. Has anything really changed? How did the consequence of Saul and Anna's journey play out in today's world? I think now what I saw from my life on Rockingham Street is that many Jews believe we can get by rather nicely without too much thought about Judaism or continuing Jewish ed. I think what I saw on Rockingham Street in the 50s and 60s is still the picture of Jewish life today. Here's a recent example. We were recently in Philadelphia visiting my son and daughter-in-law, and we took a walk in a very lovely neighborhood. We came to some friends who were having Shabbat dinner, and they came out to talk with us. One of the friends remarked that their daughter had missed the Passover Seder because she had to attend a soccer match. The mother smiled and said she was fine with this. Her exact words were, "First things first." How could I object? We'd had our Passover at Sears. But that neighbor may have been right, at least according to the Pew Report. If we examine the Pew Report, we can see that in some ways, Judaism is not the first thing for many Jews. In fact, among Jews, religious faith is the least common source of meaning of all the options presented by the survey. Look at this bar graph for just a moment, if you will. Pew asked people, what brings you the most meaning? And among Jews, the answer was in this order: family, friends, art and literature, outdoor, pets, job, and religion. That is, religion brings less satisfaction than pet ownership among Jews who are surveyed by the Pew Report. People who see this slide always tell me, yes, but isn't that true for all religions? And the answer is yes. But only 21% of Jews say religion is very important. And if you ask a non-Jew that question, the answer is 41% say religion is very important. And then this most important statistic of all. This time, for the very first time, Pew included a question: do you care if your grandchildren are Jewish? Only 34% said that it was very important. This means that almost only one-third of American Jews care deeply about whether their grandchildren are Jewish. And I think this may be the single most important finding in the Pew Report, because this is the issue that connects assimilation to continuity. And then, of course, the issue we all know about, the intermarriage issue. For Jews who were married between 2010 and 2020, the last 10 years, 61% married non-Jews. But then look at the next number. Of those who married non-Jews, just a little more than a quarter are marrying their children as Jewish by religion. If you do the math, you'll see our population will begin to decline rapidly based on that number. Well, my wife always tells me, you have to end the story on a positive note, otherwise people won't like you. So I wonder then, is the Pew Report where we have to leave this story? Are we really not still glued to the covenant? I think we are. Are we not a people who share some of the highest ideals of human civilization? I think the answer must be yes. So I do see hope. And I see hope when I try to understand how Joe struggled to reclaim his identity, because I didn't really get to the end of the story. And here's how the story actually ends. In 2001, Joe was called to the Bima to read his Torah portion in Hebrew. And I'd like to read to you how I summed that experience up in the concluding parts of my memoir. Despite, or perhaps because of all these passages, Joe moves toward a more meaningful embrace of his Judaism. As Joe is nearing his 83rd birthday, he decides to follow the Jewish tradition of having a second bar mitzvah celebration on the 70th anniversary of his earlier bar mitzvah. But this time, Joe insists he will read in Hebrew from the Torah scroll, for which he prepares for many weeks. Joe reads the Torah portion called Vayigash, the one we just read. In some ways, it is his story as well. The biblical Joseph has a confrontation with his brothers, whom he has not seen in many years. They do not recognize him in part because he has become the viceroy of Egypt, second in authority only to Pharaoh. At this moment of confrontation and revelation, Joseph says to his brothers, "I am Joseph." But it is a statement of disclosure to both himself and his brothers, who had failed to see who he was. Now, both he and his brothers see him for who he truly is, not an assimilated Egyptian, second in command, but as a member of the Hebrew tribe a few generations before the giving of Torah. So too our Joseph, who was ready to recognize his own Jewish soul, the soul that had been transmitted to him from Saul and Anna, and the hundreds of generations that preceded him. Now he could say to himself in the community, "I am Joseph." What did I learn in writing my memoir? Despite Joe and Esther's shortcomings, they left me with this: the unshakable belief that we have an obligation to join a synagogue and be active in our Jewish community. I don't see how Judaism can survive unless we show up. And I know at Adat Shalom we do that. But if and when we do show up, we need to know more about our history, our heritage, and our sacred text. I call this the Shakespeare Issue. And here I rely on Barry Schrage again. He said Jewish literacy has to be our highest priority. It's a remarkable comment, and you don't hear it often. His thesis is that we got off track when our grandparents moved away from literacy and thus lost the meaning of being Jewish. He said we have to know Maimonides as well as Shakespeare. He was way too optimistic about how much we know about Shakespeare. But the point is well taken. Schrage is telling us that the ability to read and interpret our sacred text is key. We can't rely on the low-hanging fruit to capture the meaning of our faith. I don't think we're going to make it with summer camp and birthright and lox of bagels. I think we have to understand the value of Jewish literacy. So my memoir is what it was like to growing up on Rockingham Street in the era of the cornflakes president. The Pew Report and what I saw, I think, is a warning that we're falling short. I think assimilation is like climate change. The ice cap is melting. I believe there's a direct link between Jewish literacy and Jewish survival. Those of us who sit in synagogue on Shabbat, or at least who used to, who consider ourselves dedicated to Judaism, we know something's not quite working. Many of our children are voting with their feet and leaving much of Judaism behind. The legacy we are handing down is becoming thinner each year. Conversation on Jewish survival has got to embrace the shortfall in Jewish literacy. Without the hard work and discipline, there's no telling where we may be headed. So this I know for sure. We really don't want the Pew Report to be the last word. So thank you for listening. And before I say the final word, I want to add one final thought. And thank you for listening, and here's why. In doing these talks, I've learned something that I didn't expect to learn, and that is one never finishes writing a book. And every time I give one of these talks, I learn something new. And much of that comes from the very generous and kind thoughts I get later in emails and in calls. So thank you all very much. And I'm sorry we couldn't be in person, but it was a pleasure seeing you all today. So I don't know what the protocol is about chats or questions. There is a few minutes more. People would like to ask questions or put them in the chat or what?
Maybe people can just raise their hands. You can call on them. They just need to.
Okay. I see Ralph Netkin just raised his hand.
Yeah. Thanks for taking care of hanging by a thread. I like this. You know, you tied a lot of threads together, and it makes me think of a talit. There's a lot extra blue threads here.
It's a funny analogy.
But could you say a little bit about, you're a great storyteller. Can you say a little about your own personal relation to, because as a kid, you at some point you bought into it and suddenly realized it was important. And I know
Yeah.
that's a very tough sell. Can you say a little about your own personal conversion?
I'd be happy. It's actually, that's a whole nother book.
Yes.
And I get that question a lot. And I think what happened was, and Marcia Teichman said this to me. Marcia, you don't remember, you said, I asked you once, and here's exactly what you told me. You said, my parents only showed up twice a year. And I said, how come you turned out to be so brilliant? And you said, I guess you have the spark or you don't. I don't know if you remember saying that to me. It was during an ONEG. And I actually put it in the book. So I think I had the spark. But the real transformation for me was in 2010, I had the chance to go to Pardes in Israel on a program they call the Executive Learning Session. And I only went because my wife gave me an iPod for Father's Day, and I listened to something called a podcast, which I had never heard before. And I typed in Judaism and up came Pardes. So I started listening to the weekly Torah portions, and I decided I had to go to Israel and meet these scholars. And when I met them, I frankly was overwhelmed by immersive textual study. And I never realized how much was there until that experience. And I've been back several times. I've served on the board of Pardes. I've served on the board of the RRC. I had a fleeting romance with the Dad Shalom on the board. So I think I had the spark, to use Marcia's word. And I think Pardes brought that spark alive for me. So that's the short version of that story. So Stan, somebody else had a question, I think.
Yeah, I had more than one, but one of the things I want to talk about is the assimilation question. Did anybody do a study of how many new Jews are made by assimilation? In other words, the non-Jew converts to Judaism. Does anybody have a look at that?
Stan, I don't know. I mean, the answer, obviously could be more than a few because,
oh yeah,
a lot of intermarried. But look, the Pew report said this: only 28% of the intermarried Jews from the last decade raised their children as Jewish. So if you had 100 Jews and 68% intermarry, and of those only 25% raise their children as Jewish, you get down to 15 Jews out of 100.
Yeah, well, that's true.
I mean, that's
a pretty small number.
That's a scary number. By the way, I had an Orthodox friend of mine who looked at those bar graphs, and he said, you're reading them wrong. What they show is that, of course, they show that the Orthodox are gaining and the Reform and the Conservative are shrinking, which in his mind simply means the Orthodox will return to ascendancy and become the dominant force in American Judaism. I don't know that I believe that, but it's a different count. It's a counter view on how to read the Pew report.
But they're only at 8 to 10% now.
Yeah, they're small, right? They're doing better though on retaining.
Yeah, well, that would be expected, right?
Right.
But there's also a split off with Orthodox and modern Orthodox. So there's there's a change to it. Also, the other question is on the young people side. It used to be our experience that, and it was actually, Carol, my experience to a certain extent, that people, when they are first married and they're starting their life and they don't have children, kind of drift away. But once they have children, particularly when they get to the Torah school age, they come back. And now some of them obviously come back and stay in the sense, and some come back and once the bar mitzvah is over, they leave. But is there any study of the trend of people that you would say are no longer interested, but then become either interested or reinterested because once they have a family, they get more involved?
I mean, Stan, you know the anecdotal answer to that question. In fact, if you remember when Sid founded Adat Shalom, he said, we are not going to be a bar mitzvah factory.
Oh, yes. Oh, sure.
But we are a bar mitzvah factory. Although I like our bar mitzvahs far better than I like my own, to be honest. The anecdotal testimony, all rabbis that I talk to and say the same thing. After the bar mitzvah training, the family and the bar mitzvah student tend to drift away. I don't know in our own community if that's as true. In fact, I do think in a funny way, we are an outlier at Adat Shalom. I think we have more Jewish education. We have more extremely well-informed Jews than I think I ever saw growing up in Arlington. I think the number of very learned lay members is really quite astounding. In fact, one of the things that has impressed me the most about our community is the extraordinary degree of knowledge throughout our membership. But I don't think we're typical. And I've got children who are millennials, whatever that means. And I know what happens when you first get married and have children. You don't have time to think about joining a synagogue. I mean, you're simply overwhelmed with the new chores of being a parent. And I'm watching my kids. I don't even think they knew that Passover was coming. At least we went to Sears to celebrate. Oh dear. Hey, Myrna, yes. Go ahead. I think you're on mute, Myrna.
I'd like to share an observation about participation in learning. So I attend Rachel's class on Wednesday, in which she teaches the Parsha. And we have about 20 to 25. That's David. Yeah.
Right.
I also attend the Artist Israel Friday study class. And I think, David, you have.
I do, right, I have, yeah.
And the statistic there is maybe 30 to 40, but their congregation is about 3 to 4 times the size of our congregation. So I think it's very, it sort of backs up or supports what you said, David, about the proportion of people in our congregation who are either learned or are interested in learning. Whereas,
I think that's right.
Yeah, and I just was struck by the
yes. Yeah, it's funny, so Myrna,
Alice has some very learned people, but it's a very, very large congregation.
Yeah, absolutely. So here's a secret. I'll disclose to you for the first time. Okay. It was at the Artist Israel Friday class where I heard with the rabbi with the beard. He said, American Judaism is hanging by a thread. So I wrote it in my notebook. And I said, one day I'm going to give a talk with that title. And I will tell you, I've also made the exact same observation. I said, 40 out of the thousands they have compared to our 20 plus for our 400 is really quite remarkable. Quite remarkable. Kevin or Marcia, one of you, Kevin?
Yeah. First of all, I'm sitting next to the spark, so I don't need to wear a sweater on this cold day. But I want to go back to the book a little bit. David, what do you think Saul's thoughts would have been of watching Joe read Torah? And what would Saul's thoughts be about you as a Reconstructionist Jew as a way of trying to bring Judaism into this society that we live in?
I think Saul would have cried at my father's bar mitzvah. So, his celebration of his bar mitzvah. I think Saul finally came around very, very late, the last couple of years in his life. I think I do have some recollection of him in shul with a talit and trying to daven and saying as many Hebrew words as he remembered. I don't know what they'd say about Reconstructionism. I think they'd just be happy if we were going to services. I think at the end of the day, they probably wish they had done more. But I think I think the key point is it's really not, we don't want to get to that point in life and just regret we didn't do more. I think part of the problem we have with Judaism, we don't really know what the recipe is. We sense something's wrong. And some people at these talks say, so what should we be doing? And I say, look, I'd have to start my life all over again to answer that. And go to Jewish day school, and then go to yeshiva, and then become ordained, and then study statistics. And then I could tell you what the data shows and what the experience shows. But we just hang out, and we observe, and we rely on anecdotal evidence. But Pew is the body count. And like it or not, they're not good numbers. They're just not. So, you know, I've tried to refocus the discussion from assimilation to literacy, and that comes from my Pardes experience. Didn't one or both of you go to one of the Pardes learning sessions, Kevin, Marcia?
Go ahead.
I said I sat in on a couple of sessions. I wish I knew what the recipe was. I mean, we raised 3 kids, sent them to 13 years of Jewish day school, and checked every other box you possibly could check, and school is still out. And that's true of their peers. So I think the influence of, you know, your peers and the group that you circulate with plays a tremendous role. One book I want to mention, which some of us on the screen here have read, and I don't know if you're familiar with it, but this is Sarah Horowitz's Here
Yeah.
All Along,
Right.
Finding Meaning, Spirituality, Deeper Connection to Life in Judaism after finally choosing to look there. And I read the book and I was blown away by it. I just felt she did a yeoman's job of, in a short period herself, you know, being product of Jewish education that completely alienated her, but she had an experience at a retreat. I think it was with the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, and did a turnaround, and in a few short years really did a tremendous amount of study. I bought the book and I subsequently given it to 4 different people who are tangentially
Their own copies.
yeah, no, I bought them their own copies, and I haven't really followed up to see if this text moved them like it moved me.
What's the name of the book? Could you repeat it?
It's by Sarah Hurwitz, and she actually was a speechwriter initially for Barack Obama, and then ultimately moved over and became the speechwriter for Sarah Hurwitz. It's called Here All Along,
Okay,
referring
thank
to the fact that the depth of the tradition has always been there, but she couldn't tap into it. But she certainly does in this book. And I'm just saying, my sense was I wanted to throw it at every single person who has been marginally identified, although I don't know, you know, I think there's a part of me that still feels that there's some kind of an internal pull that some of us have and others don't. Some of us like to build with blocks, and some of us like trains, and some of us like dolls. You know, I wish the literacy were the key, but it's still.
Yeah, I understand. I had the same question.
And interestingly enough, I'm a little embarrassed to admit that when I was a younger person, and I had a fairly strong Jewish education, interestingly enough, at Arlington, Fairfax, Dave and I have talked about our experience somewhat, and uh-oh, I just lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. Where did it go? All right, maybe in a moment. No, that's what happens, I guess, when you go off on a tangent. All right.
All right. Well, anybody else have any other? I know we're past the hour.
Yeah,
Well,
Has her hand up.
Diane has her hand up.
okay.
Yes, hi.
Hi.
Well,
Oh, you had that.
This is kind of continuing on what Marcia has said. Speaking personally, I care very much about whether or not my grandchildren are Jewish. However, my children don't have that same passion, and my grandchildren are very far from it. And they know I'm Jewish. They know they are Jewish, but that's about the extent of it. And with the literacy, I know Marcia and I have read the same book. I couldn't get my sons or grandson to read it. They think it's kind of quaint, I think, it's an interesting part of grandma, but that's about the extent of it.
Well, I have 2 grandchildren by my older son, Robert. One had a bar mitzvah and one didn't. And I couldn't even get my son to push my grandson into having one. So, you know, they know we eat lox and bagels. I don't think they know much more about being Jewish. So, But I think Marcia made a point, and it's, I'm not sure. Look, I do believe literacy is at the key. And those of us who go to these programs, including Rachel's on Wednesdays and Otis on Fridays, I think what we discover, there's something very magical about reading the Hebrew text immersively. I think it is transformative, but it takes a lot of work and effort. And, you know, people don't have the energy and the discipline to do it. So, Ingrid, you have a question?
I
think you
have
might
a
be on.
comment. I have a comment, and that is, excuse me, we live in a secular world now because of science and also the Holocaust. You know, there are people who just don't care about religion anymore. And to me, the most important thing we could do, especially if you look at that chart, what's the most important thing to people? Their family, their friends, and then things that are entertaining. Okay, I think the most important thing we can do is make it fun to be Jewish. Make it something that is really meaningful in their lives. My mother told me, she grew up in a very Orthodox home, not Haredi. But she told me that being Jewish you celebrate being Jewish in your family, with your family, in the home, not in a synagogue. We did belong to a congregation, but she said it comes from the home. And she was a Dutch Jew. So, you know, it has to come out of our homes. We have to make it lots of fun. We had our kids dancing around our living room, on our unfurnished living room, on Shabbat. And it was fun for them. You know, I'm not a model of perfection because our son is not really that identifying anymore, but he really slams people on the web if they're anti-Semitic. He goes after them. So he's strongly identifying, even though he doesn't realize it. But so there's more than just there are ways of teaching them, is what I'm trying to say.
Right,
we have
right.
to pull them in with what matters to them.
Right.
I talked
right.
too
No,
long.
yeah.
Sorry.
No, good point. Very good points. Thank you. Larry.
Bruce.
Oh, I'm sorry, Bruce.
How did the Shoah affect your parents? Or because you didn't, in your talk, you didn't mention their reactions when 6 million Jews were killed. Okay. And did that have any impact on them? Did the 6-Day War, prior to the 6-Day War, did that have any impact on their thinking? Another comment. Today, because the state of Israel exists, if you're concerned about literacy, go on vacation to Israel. In the winter, go to Eilat. We are all upper middle class. If you consider it important for literacy, not necessarily politics and so on. All right. We have an opportunity to show our children that there is a place where people do speak Hebrew, not to read it in the Bible and so on, that it is a living language. My daughter went to the Jewish day school, so she knew some Hebrew, but she also went to Tel Aviv University and studied for a semester at the university.
Wow.
All
Nice.
right. And so there are
Yeah,
opportunities for that.
Right.
What I'm more concerned with is not whether or not they're religion and so forth and so on, but how do our children behave or react to conditions around them? Are they concerned with social justice and so on in America or in Israel? You know, whatever.
Right.
If one is not, you could be an Orthodox Jew and you can vote for the Republicans, and you can become the major conservative. Okay, but you call yourself Jewish. That's saving the Jewish people. I'm not too sure exactly what that is. Okay, so there are other things that I consider important.
Right.
Okay. One of the things that we are now doing with our adult children, every Friday night, we just have a Kabbalah Shabbat on Zoom because they're all over the world. Okay, the two of them, okay? And it's just maybe for 5 or 6 minutes, sometimes longer and so on. And it's just something that they enjoy now, just as an opportunity for the family to get together every Friday night sometime. And you could do that.
Right,
If you have
right.
little
That sounds lovely.
grandchildren,
Yeah,
you can do something like that also, lighting the
right,
candles.
right.
Begin the own tradition. You know, so I think there are ways to make grandchildren or children feel happy about that. Sending them to camp. Going to camp is a nice experience. They'll have a good time, most kids. Make it a Jewish camp. Our movement has Chavaya. I sent my kids to Habonim. Their best friends are fellow campers. After all these years, because this was a very intense emotional experience. They may not be members of synagogues and so on. That really does not, in my mind, it doesn't matter that much now. Maybe later on, but that's their choice. I do like their politics. I do like their social action. And that's really what I am most concerned with.
Right, right. All right, good points. Yeah, very valid. Ingrid? Okay. Well, everybody, thank you very much for joining me. I guess I was going to say, I hope to see you in Shul, but I don't know if I'm still Zooming. But thank you, and I hope everybody does well in the coming weeks and stays safe.
Thank you.
David.
Okay.
Really
Look,
good.
All right, thank you. Okay, bye-bye.